For 10 years no man asked her to dance, and the Duke crossed the ballroom looking only at her. The ballroom of Ashcombe House had a habit that season, and the habit was music that never quite reached the corners. Played, of course. It played in great glittering arcs above the polished floor, where the young women in their pale silks turned like blossoms in a slow current, and where the older matrons watched from the gilt chairs with eyes that missed nothing and forgave less. But the music, having done its duty at the center, thinned as it traveled outward, until it became at last only a suggestion at the edges, a hush behind the ferns, a whisper along the pillars, a rumor beside the tall windows where the January cold pressed its face against the glass and listened. The music behaved, that winter, like a guest who has been invited but not quite welcomed. It stayed near the host and would not wander. By one of those windows, half hidden by a curtain the color of old rose, stood a young woman who had been standing in that particular place, or in a place very much like it, for 10 years. Her name was Miss Charlotte Merrivale. She was 28 years old. She had first stood at this window at 18, in the spring after her brother Henry's death, when her family's mourning had not quite lifted and no one had known yet what to do with a young woman who did not wish to dance and was not asked to. She had stood at it again at 19, and at 20, when the mourning had lifted and yet the not being asked had not. And by 22 it had ceased to feel like an accident and had begun to feel like a fact. Facts, Charlotte had discovered by 23, were not the worst of the world's inventions. Facts could be kept. Facts could be lived beside. What harmed a person was not fact but hope that had been asked to survive too many Januaries in a row. Charlotte had, by 25, put the hope away in a small locked drawer of her mind and kept only the fact, and the fact had been kind to her, in its way, because a fact does not disappoint. She wore a gown of pale gray silk, plain in cut and long in the sleeve, the neckline high and modest, the hem falling clean to the polished floor, and around her throat a single strand of her mother's pearls that had gone soft with age and use. Her hair, a deep chestnut brown, was drawn back into a coil low at her nape, and her hands, which were long and steady and useful, were clasped quietly before her. She was not ugly. She had never been ugly. She had a face that was, upon patient inspection, rather fine, grave gray eyes, a wide, serious mouth, a jaw that spoke of an old family and old bones. But Miss Merrivale was not the sort of face that ballrooms noticed, because ballrooms notice motion, and Miss Merrivale had learned, over 10 long seasons, to stand very still. She had learned this the way one learns a language one did not choose. First by accident, then by habit, then by preference. When you have stood at the edge of enough rooms, you begin to prefer edges. You begin to understand them. You begin to feel that the center of a ballroom is a small, brightly lit country whose citizenship is denied you at the border, and that the edges, the pillars, the windows, the shadowed doorways, are your own quieter kingdom, and that in this kingdom you may at least keep your dignity. She kept it now, on this particular night, as she had kept it on so many others. Her sister Amelia was dancing. Amelia was 22 and had eyes the color of a summer lake, and Amelia had never in her life stood by a window at a ball. Charlotte watched her sister spin, and watched her sister laugh, and watched the young Viscount who was leading her sister spin and laugh, and Charlotte felt for her sister only what she always felt. A soft, unguarded pleasure, undimmed by comparison. The curtain against her shoulder smelled faintly of dust and lavender water, and the wood of the window frame at her back was cold enough through the silk of her gown that she felt it as a small steady line along her shoulder blade, like a hand of remembrance. Outside, in the black winter garden, the yew hedges stood in their iron rows and did not stir. Inside, the ballroom exhaled its warm, complicated breath, the wax of 100 candles, the perfume of gardenia and rosewater, the faint iron of the punch, the polish of the parquet floor. Charlotte breathed it in and did not name any of it. She had, over 10 Januaries of exactly this air, learned not to name pleasures she could not have. She only stood and she only watched and she only kept at the small polite border of her own attention, a running civil count of the persons in the room who had noticed her, which tonight, as on every other night, stood at none. She had made her peace with comparison long ago. There is no room in a heart for both peace and envy, and Charlotte had chosen peace, because peace was the only country in which she had ever been offered a passport. The clock on the mantel across the room struck 10. The music, obedient to its habits, drew back a little for a country dance, and the corners grew for a moment louder than the center. Chairs scraping, fans clicking, the low murmuring commerce of matchmaking mothers who had come here on business. It was at this moment that a change entered the room, though at first no one but Charlotte seemed to notice. She noticed because she had spent 10 years training herself to notice. Standing at the edges of rooms teaches you to read them. She had learned to feel the small pressure changes in a crowd, the way a wave feels the tide before it turns. She felt one now. It came in from the east door, from the long paneled corridor that led up from the hall, and it moved through the ballroom the way weather moves through a valley. First as an unease among the trees, then as a stirring, then as a bright hard fact. There was a particular way that mothers of unmarried daughters lifted their heads when a person of consequence entered a room, a small, involuntary upward motion, no larger than the movement made by an animal at a distant sound. Charlotte had studied it for 10 years without ever having been the reason for it. She saw it now in a soft ripple around the far side of the floor. Lady Brackenwell first, then Mrs. Delamere, then old Lady Pine, who was reputed to have gone deaf in 1799 and who now, at 81, appeared to have recovered her hearing on the instant. Behind them a fan that had been idly beating stopped mid-arc. A whispered word passed between two matrons in matching mulberry silk. The word did not carry to Charlotte, but its shape did, and its shape was a title. A duke had come. Charlotte did not, in that first moment, know that he was a duke. She only knew that a tall, dark-haired gentleman had entered by the east door and stood for a moment beneath the arch, and that the whole ballroom had felt him. Fans paused 1/8 of an inch behind smiles. Mothers turned their heads a shade too quickly and pretended they had not. Even the musicians, who ought to have known nothing of any of it, played the next bar of the country dance a hair too crisply, as if a sharper hand had taken the baton. The gentleman under the arch did not appear to notice any of this. He was perhaps 32, tall, with a dark head and a very still bearing, and he wore an evening coat of a color so deep a blue it was almost black, plainly cut, with none of the ornament that lesser men use to insist upon themselves. He had the face of a man who had been abroad for a long time and had learned there to look at rooms rather than to shine in them. His eyes were dark and quiet. He held his gloves in one hand as if he had forgotten he was holding them. Charlotte, without meaning to, catalogued him. It was a habit born of 10 years of edges. She noted the plainness of his tailoring, which she took at first for indifference and then, on second inspection, for confidence. The kind of confidence that does not require to be pointed out. She noted the small, unfashionable cut of his cravat, which had been tied by a man who had tied it himself and had not permitted a valet to fuss it into a knot. She noted his boots, which were polished but not glossy, and his hands, which were long and brown at the knuckles, the hands of a man who had held reins in weather. She noted the very slight favoring of his weight upon his left side. An old riding injury, she guessed, or a horse fall, healed but remembered. She noted, last, that his eyes traveled the room in a single unhurried arc and settled on nothing they were looking for, and that when they at last settled on something, they settled on her and did not move. He stood beneath the arch for perhaps 6 seconds. And then he began to walk. He did not walk toward the dancers. He did not walk toward his hostess, Lady Ashcombe, who had risen half an inch from her chair and was preparing the smile she used for people of consequence. He walked, instead, along a line that Charlotte, watching from her curtain, did not at first understand. A line that ran diagonally, unhurried, past the ferns, past the small band of young ladies waiting to be claimed for the next set, past the Dowager Countess of Trilling and her 2 granddaughters. A line that traced, straight and unshaded, across the polished floor of the ballroom. A line that ended at Charlotte. She had time, in the 6 or 7 seconds it took him to close the distance, to consider the small physical facts of what was happening to her. Her mouth had gone dry. Her palms had gone cool. Her heart, which had a habit of quietness, was doing something considerably less quiet inside the cage of her ribs. She recognized none of these sensations as her own. They belonged, in her private accounting, to other women, women who were noticed, women whose names were spoken in the corners of ballrooms. That such sensations should have arrived at her particular window, at this particular hour, in the 28th year of a life that had learned to expect nothing at balls, seemed to her, in that moment, less a miracle than an administrative error. She realized it only when he was perhaps a dozen paces away. Then her breath, which had been an easy quiet thing, went odd in her chest. He had not once, in his long steady walk across that room, looked at anyone else. Not the dancers, not the hostess, not the pretty girl in the yellow gown who had angled herself half into his path with the practiced grace of a season's veteran. He had looked, from the moment he entered under the arch, at exactly one person in the room, and that person was standing behind a curtain the color of old rose. He stopped in front of her at exactly the polite Regency distance, and he bowed. It was not the small tight bow of a gentleman doing a duty. It was a full, careful, honest bow, the bow of a man who has meant to make it for some time. "Miss Merrivale," he said. His voice was low. It carried, as low voices do in still air, further than a shout. "May I have the honor of the next dance?" He did not phrase it as a question. It was not asked. It was offered. Charlotte, who had not been asked to dance by any man not already engaged to a cousin of hers in 10 full seasons, and who had not been offered a dance by a stranger since a summer picnic when she was 17 and Amelia was 11 and the world had not yet made up its mind about her, Charlotte, standing very still behind her curtain, said nothing at all. Because Charlotte, in that instant, could not have said her own name. 200 miles to the north and 48 hours earlier, a man had been standing in the library of an old grey house on the Yorkshire moors, and he had been reading a letter. The library was a long, high room, its walls lined to the ceiling with books that had been chosen by 4 generations of a family that read. A fire burned in the grate, low and steady, throwing warm gold light onto the worn Turkish carpet. The moors outside were white with a thin morning snow, and the sky was the color of pewter, and the man at the desk had been reading the letter for a long time. His name was Edmund Ashford, and he was the 8th Duke of Ravencourt, though he did not much care for the second half of that description and had spent the better part of the last 3 years abroad in an effort to avoid using it. He was 32. He had a lean, dark face, weathered by wind and sun, and eyes that were dark and quiet in the way of men who have been alone with themselves for a long stretch of years. He wore a plain grey riding coat, because he had come in only an hour before from the frozen Tennant Road, and his boots by the fire were still steaming faintly. The letter he held was 6 pages long. It was in a hand he had known since he was 7 years old. It was from his father's oldest friend, Colonel Percival Halston, who had been dead now these 14 months and whose voice, in the hand upon the paper, was as clear to him as if the man himself sat in the leather chair opposite. The letter was a will. Not the will of law and lawyers, which had been read a year ago in a London office to the family. It was the other will, the private letter left for the young Duke alone, to be delivered on the anniversary of the Colonel's death, and containing what the Colonel had wanted to say to him and had not, in his cautious careful life, quite dared to speak aloud. Edmund had read it twice through and was reading it a third time more slowly. Toward the middle of the 3rd page, at the point where he had, both times before, drawn a slow breath and set his teeth, the Colonel's hand became firmer. "There is one thing more, my boy, and I put it to you plainly because I have not much longer to put anything to you at all. You are a good man. You are also a lonely man, and being a duke will not cure it. What will cure it, God willing, is a wife. I am going to name a lady. You will forgive an old man his liberty. 10 years ago at Ashcombe there was a girl called Charlotte Merrivale. You will not remember her. She was 17, standing by a window, and your father and I stood by the fire, and I saw her. She had a face I have not forgotten. Not the face of beauty, which fades. The face of steadiness, which does not. She was in mourning for a brother, and no one asked her to dance. And she stood by that window for 2 hours together and never once made a face of self-pity. I watched her for 2 hours. I remembered that face. I have made inquiries. She has not married. In 10 seasons no man has asked her, because our society is a foolish society, and it does not read faces well. I ask you to go to London in January when the small season begins, and to go to Ashcombe House on the night of the first ball, and to look for her and to ask her to dance. If she is what I think she is, and I think she is, and I have been right before, then you will know within the hour whether an old man's meddling has served you. I do not command you. I do not even quite ask. I only put it to you because I loved your father, and I love you, and I would like to die easier. Edmund read it a fourth time. He set the letter down. It sat on the leather blotter between his elbows for a long while, folded now. For squares of the plain cream paper he had folded and unfolded 3 times already, and he did not touch it again. He had, in 3 years abroad, taught himself the discipline of not answering a difficult letter on the same day he read it. He had learned this discipline first in the diplomatic pouches of Vienna, where a wrong answer set down at midnight had a way of making itself into next month's treaty by morning, and he had learned it more slowly in his own private correspondence, where a hasty answer to a dying friend was a discourtesy that could not be recalled. He kept, therefore, his hands quiet upon the blotter, and he watched the fire, and he permitted the request itself to lie open in his mind the way a good horse permits a saddle, with wariness at first, then with an acceptance that is not surrender. He looked at the fire for a long while. The moor beyond the window was very quiet under its thin snow. A single crow, somewhere in the beech plantation at the foot of the south lawn, called once and did not call again. In the grate a coal settled with the small dry sigh of a coal that has spent all it had. Edmund did not move. He was, by nature and by 3 years' habit, a man who thought slowly on paper and slowly in silence, and he had learned in Vienna that the temptation to answer a difficult question quickly was almost always the temptation to answer it wrongly. He sat, therefore, and he watched the fire, and he permitted the colonel's voice, that steady, dry, unmelodramatic voice he had known since he was 7, to lay its request against the walls of his own reluctance. He did not, when he rose at last, take up a pen. He rang, instead, for his valet. He asked, in an even tone, for his traveling case to be brought down, and for a fresh horse to be saddled in the morning, and for word to be sent ahead to Ravencourt House in Grosvenor Square that the family shutters should be opened and the fires laid. Only when the valet had gone did he look once more at the letter, and once more at the fire, and say, to the empty room, in the quietest voice he possessed, "Very well, sir. Very well, Miss Merrivale," said the Duke a second time, and there was in his low voice a courtesy so exact that Charlotte, who had been holding her breath, remembered that she was permitted to breathe. "Forgive me, I did not intend to startle you." She found her voice. It surprised her by working. "You have not startled me, sir," said Charlotte. It was a small, gentle, entirely dignified lie. "I did not, however, expect to be asked." "That is a great pity," he said, "and it does the room no credit. Will you come?" His gloved hand held out was very steady. Charlotte looked at his hand. She looked at his face. His face was not smiling. It was, instead, an attentive face, the face of a man who was listening to her, though she had not yet said anything worth listening to. It came to her with a small, sharp shock that no man in a ballroom had looked at her with that particular kind of listening face in a very great while. She placed her hand on his. He did not close his fingers over hers greedily, as some men do. He simply turned, and led her out of her curtain, and across the polished floor and toward the center. The ballroom parted for them the way water parts for a keel. It did not part for her. Charlotte was under no illusion on that head. Parted for him. But she was, for the first time in 10 years, on the correct side of that parting. The pretty girl in the yellow gown watched them go by with an expression that a less charitable woman than Charlotte would have called murder. Charlotte, being charitable by long habit, called it only surprise and let it pass. The musicians, taking a small cue from Lady Ashcombe, began the opening bars of a slow set, a dance that permitted conversation. Charlotte suspected, faintly, that this had been arranged. She was correct. The Duke set his hand at the correct polite distance from her waist. He did not touch her. Regency propriety was fastidious about the distance of hands at balls, and this Duke was more fastidious than the propriety. And when the music began, and Charlotte, who danced perfectly well, though no one had noticed in 10 years, took the first step, she found that her partner moved with her exactly. He was not a showy dancer. She had never liked showy dancers. He danced the way he walked, with a settled quiet economy, as if dancing were only another form of paying attention. "You dance well, Miss Merrivale," he said, quietly, as they turned. "So do you, sir. You are surprised." "I am, sir, yes." She considered this. Because, she said, in my experience, gentlemen who ask ladies to dance for the first time in a season are often doing so to be observed by other ladies. Such gentlemen dance in a manner that is very visible. You do not. He smiled for the first time, then. It was a small smile, private, quickly gone. That, he said, is a very exact observation. I have had time to make observations, sir. So I understand. There was, at this, a small pause in which Charlotte felt the ballroom drop away by perhaps 3 inches, and the man opposite her come 3 inches nearer, though neither of them had moved. You understand? She said. Miss Merrivale, said the Duke, I have not come to Ashcombe House tonight for a general purpose. I have come to ask you to dance. He said it the way one gives a report, plainly, without flourish, as a soldier speaks to a superior officer. Charlotte, who had been dancing more or less on autopilot, missed a half-beat and recovered. I do not know you, sir, she said. You do not. I am aware. My name is Edmund Ashford. I am the Duke of Ravencourt. I have been abroad 3 years. I came into London this morning. I came to Ashcombe House because I was told you would be here. Told by whom, sir? By an old man who died 14 months ago and had reasons. He said this as if he had already understood he could not, and would not, dance around the fact of what he was doing, and had decided the only respectful course was to tell her at once. It struck Charlotte with an odd bright pain, in a place inside her that she had not, in 10 years, permitted anyone to touch. Sir, she said, and her voice was quite steady. Whoever the old man was, I do not think you should have come. I have thought that also, he said several times on the road. And yet I am here. Yes, sir. And yet you are here. The music slowed for its second figure. He turned her under his lifted hand. As she came back to face him, she saw that he was watching her. Not her hand, not the room, not the pretty girl in the yellow gown, but her face, with the concentration of a man reading a page for its meaning and not for its pleasantness. She had never, in 10 seasons, been looked at with that kind of concentration. She did not know what to do with it. She fell back, for safety, on courtesy. I hope, sir, she said, that the old man was a friend to you. He was my father's oldest friend, and my own since I was a child. Then I am sorry for your loss, sir. Thank you, said the Duke of Ravencourt. And then, quite quietly, you are exactly what he said you were. Charlotte looked at him. The music was ending. Around them the dancers were preparing to bow and curtsy. Charlotte, well-trained, prepared to curtsy. But she paused, one hand still lightly upon his, and looked at his face and said, in a voice pitched only for him, And what, sir, did he say I was? Steady, said Edmund Ashford. He said you were steady, and that our society did not know how to read your face. The last chord fell. Charlotte curtsied. He bowed. It was a bow, again, of a full and careful and honest kind. And when he offered his arm to lead her from the floor, she took it, because Charlotte Merrivale was steady, and steady women, when a strange duke has told them the truth in the middle of a country dance, do not run. Ashcombe House, when the ball was over, held a hard little council in a small blue drawing-room at the top of the stairs, and Charlotte was not present at it, and Charlotte's mother was. Lady Merrivale was a woman of 53, in a gown of lavender silk, and she had for the last 2 hours conducted herself with an admirable outward calm, and was now beginning to make up for the outward calm by an internal storm the size of a small navy. He asked her to dance, she said, for the 3rd time, to her sister-in-law Lady Ellsworth. He asked Charlotte. He did not ask Amelia. I saw it, sister. He asked Charlotte, and he spoke to no one else, and he took her in to supper, and he brought her out of supper, and he asked her to dance again, and when she declined the second dance because she would not be talked about, he only bowed and said he would call in the morning. He will call in the morning. He will call in the morning, and I do not understand it. Lady Ellsworth, who was fond of her niece and fonder still of a story, poured her sister a glass of ratafia and said, My dear, does it need to be understood? It needs, at minimum, to be believed, and I am having trouble. He is 32, unmarried, only recently returned from abroad. He has by all accounts been in the diplomatic service in Vienna for 3 years. He has no known attachment. He is a duke, and he has crossed a ballroom for our Charlotte. For our Charlotte, whom every man in London has managed not to notice for 10 seasons. For our Charlotte, whom every man in London is a fool. Lady Merrivale, who had been 53 years a woman and knew a truth when it was set down beside her, said softly, yes. Yes, that is fair. She looked into her glass. I have failed her, she said. Every year. I have failed her. I have said the wrong things at the wrong times. I have compared her aloud to Amelia. I have told her once that if she would only laugh more, as if a laugh could be commanded like a footman. And now this man comes, and looks at her as if he had been reading her for a year, and I do not know what to do with it, and I do not know what to do with myself for not having read her so myself all these years. Lady Ellsworth reached across the small tea-table, and laid her hand upon her sister's. You will, she said, do what you can, and I will help you, and Charlotte, whatever happens with this Duke, will know at last that she was worth crossing a room for. That, my dear, is not a small thing after 10 seasons at the wall. Lady Merrivale did not answer for a long moment. She set down her ratafia. She looked into the low fire in the small drawing-room grate, at the pale blue silk of her sister-in-law's evening dress, at her own hands which had, she was surprised to see, begun to tremble a very little in her lap. It came to her, sitting in that small blue room at 2 in the morning while a house full of guests slept below, that she had spent the last 10 years of her mothering explaining Charlotte, in patient careful sentences, to strangers who had not asked. That she had explained her to the vicar's wife, and to the milliner at Bond Street, and to her own second cousin at Bath. That she had spoken always of Charlotte's steadiness as a compensation for something, for what, she could not now precisely remember. And it came to her, sitting there, that her elder daughter had needed no compensating for ever, and that this was a thing she had known and had chosen not to know, because knowing it would have required her to say a certain sentence to her elder daughter that she had never said, and to unsay a number of other sentences she had. She began, quietly, in the small blue drawing-room, to compose the necessary sentence in her head. Upstairs, in a bedroom papered in a soft green, Charlotte was undressing by candlelight, and her maid, an elderly woman called Peggs who had known her since Charlotte was 8 years old, was hanging up the plain grey silk with unusual care. Miss Charlotte, said Peggs at last, folding the silk in her arms as if it had done something remarkable. Miss Charlotte. Yes, Peggs. He is coming in the morning. He is coming in the morning. He asked me at the door. Did he? He asked me, Miss Charlotte, whether you were often at Ashcombe balls, and whether you were fond of the country, and whether you were kind to horses. Charlotte, who had been quietly loosening her hair, went quite still. Kind to horses? Yes, miss. Why did he ask if I was kind to horses? I could not tell, miss. But he asked it very carefully, as if the answer mattered to him more than the other two. Charlotte considered this. Charlotte, in the 10 years of her wall-standing, had made a habit of being kind to horses. In particular, she had made a habit at Ashcombe balls of walking through the stables on her way in, because the stables were on the way in, and because horses looked at her with the same steady, honest attention that people did not. She had once, at 17, at that same summer picnic, given her handkerchief to a young stable boy to bind up a cut on a bay gelding's fetlock. She had not remembered doing so for 10 years. It had been an ordinary kindness. Someone, it appeared, had remembered it for her. She sat down on the edge of the bed. Peggs, she said, what was the name of that stable boy at Ashcombe? 10 years ago. The one whose bay had cut himself. That would be Ned, miss. Ned Halston, the colonel's godson. The old colonel that died last year in the north. Ah, said Charlotte very quietly. Ah. She sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, with her hair down about her shoulders, and she did not weep, because Charlotte Merrivale did not weep for small things. But she felt, for perhaps the first time in 10 years, a small, terrible, unruly kind of hope, and she was not sure that hope was a small thing at all. He called in the morning. He called at 11 o'clock, which was as early as manners permitted, and he was announced by the butler in the plain grave voice reserved for men whose titles are so large the butler will not embellish them. His Grace the Duke of Ravencourt, my lady. Lady Merrivale, in her second-best morning gown of dove-grey wool, rose and did not tremble. Charlotte, in a very plain morning gown of the same dove-grey and a fichu of white lawn fastened high at her throat, rose and did tremble a little, but only in the hands, and she folded the hands so that no one should see. He came in. He bowed. He said all the correct things and none of the excessive ones. He accepted tea and did not drink it. He asked Lady Merrivale for the very great favor of a private conversation with Miss Merrivale, in the presence of a servant if she preferred, and he said this with such an unshakable respect that Lady Merrivale, who had been prepared to insist upon a chaperone, found herself instead offering the drawing-room with only pegs in the far corner and the door half open into the hall. "I will not take much of your time, Miss Merrivale," said Edmund. Seating himself on a chair he had drawn a polite 3 feet from hers. "I owe you, however, an explanation." "You owe me nothing, sir." I do owe you something. I owe you the truth of what I did last night, because I did not do it lightly, and I do not wish you to think that I did." Charlotte, folding her hands one over the other on her lap, said quietly, "Go on." He told her about the letter. He told her about Colonel Halston. He told her about the boy Ned in the stable 10 years ago, and the bay gelding and the handkerchief. He told her about the 2 hours by the window and the mourning for her brother. He told her about the letter reaching him 3 days ago on the Yorkshire moors, and about riding for London that same afternoon, and about the arch in Ashcombe House ballroom and how he had stood there for 6 seconds and then walked. He told her, in short, exactly the truth and left nothing out, and asked no credit for any of it. He did not soften the thing that would, in a lesser man's telling, have wanted softening. He did not pretend, for example, that he had also come to Ashcombe on his own initiative, that some prior interest of his had brought him. He said plainly that he had not, that he had come on the strength of the Colonel's letter and no other cause, and that he was aware how this must sound to a woman of her sense. He did not, either, present himself as a hero for having ridden south. He said only that the Colonel had been kind to him for 25 years, and that a debt of that length, presented to a man from the grave, was not the sort of debt a person of ordinary honor was permitted to refuse. Charlotte, listening, understood, with a small and slightly startled inward click, that she was in the presence of a man who was not going to lie to her about anything ever, and that this quality of being told the truth was a thing she had not, in 28 years, been offered by any man not her father, and that it was worth, as a wedding gift, considerably more than most estates. Charlotte listened without moving. When he had finished she said, in a voice not quite steady, "You came to ask me to dance because a man who is dead told you to." "I came to ask you to dance," he said, "because a man I trusted more than any other alive had watched you for 2 hours in a ballroom when you were 17, and had thought, and had not stopped thinking for 10 years afterward, that you were the finest young woman he had seen in a London season, and that our society had missed you. I came to see whether he was right. And, sir, he was right." She looked at her hands. "You cannot know that, sir. In one dance." "Miss Merrivale," said Edmund Ashford, "I have not lived among diplomats for 3 years without learning to read a face inside an hour. I do not say I know all of you. I say I saw enough last night to know that Colonel Halston was, in this as in most things, correct." She was silent. "I have come this morning," he went on, "not to ask you to marry me. I would not insult you with a proposal upon an acquaintance of one evening, but to ask a smaller thing, and it is this. I have a small estate near Richmond, an hour outside London, that belonged to my mother. My mother's sister lives there. She is a widow of 69, a dowager viscountess by marriage, and a great deal of trouble to persons who deserve to be troubled. Her name is Lady Aurelia Weston, and she has expressed, in a letter which reached me at Ravenscourt House yesterday afternoon, a strong desire to meet you. I ask your permission to bring her to call in 3 days, and, if you and your mother permit, to invite you both to Richmond for a fortnight at the end of the month. I ask nothing else. I do not press. I only ask for time." "For time, sir?" "For time," said the Duke. "For me to be sure of you, and for you to be sure of me. I will not have you marry a stranger, Miss Merrivale. I would not do that to you." She lifted her eyes to his. "You are, sir," she said, "already less of a stranger to me than any man who has spoken to me in the last 10 years. He was silent a moment at that. He did not, she noticed, hurry to fill the silence with a courtesy. He appeared instead to consider what she had said, and to weigh it, and to place it, quietly, somewhere in himself where it would not be lost. Then he inclined his head, no more than an inch, and said, "Thank you, Miss Merrivale. That is more than I hoped for on a first call, and I shall try, for as long as you will let me, to deserve it." It was said without flourish. It was said the way he had bowed in the ballroom, with the exactness of a man for whom words, once given, were expected to be honored. Charlotte, who had heard a great many pretty speeches at a great many small dinners across 10 seasons, and had learned to discount them all at the door, found that she could not discount this one, and she was not at all sure what to do with a promise she was unable to disbelieve. He did not press her. He did not press for engagement. He did not press for understanding. He did not press for anything but the fortnight at Richmond, and he did not, in the 3 weeks that followed, once behave as if he thought her already his. He behaved instead as if he thought her worth the trouble of earning. He came to Merrivale House twice a week at the correct hour and drank the tea he did not drink and spoke to Lady Merrivale about her rheumatism and the tenants at their small property in Kent, and answered Amelia's guileless questions about Vienna with a gentle patience that made Amelia, who was 22 and had never before in her life understood that a man might be more interesting than a viscount, turn thoughtful over her needlework. And he spoke to Charlotte, always, as if she were a person and not a marriage negotiation. He asked her opinions. He asked her which authors she had read that season. He asked her, one afternoon, in a low voice by the window while Lady Merrivale was called from the room, whether she was frightened, and when Charlotte said honestly that she was, he only nodded and said, "So am I," and that was the whole of it. She had never before understood that a man might admit to being frightened, and that the admission might make her less frightened rather than more. At the end of the 3rd week the party for Richmond was made up, and on a cold clear morning in early February they set out. Lady Merrivale, Charlotte, Amelia, Peggs, and 2 hired maids, in the Duke's carriage, which came for them at 9 and moved through the winter roads with the smooth economy of a very well-kept vehicle. The Duke did not travel with them. He had ridden ahead the day before, to see that all was in readiness. It was, Charlotte thought, a mark of the man that he did not use the hour on the road to press his suit. He made sure only that they came in comfort, and then let the comfort speak for him. The house at Richmond was called Little Weston. It was not little. It was, however, called that because it stood in the shadow of an older and larger house belonging to a cadet branch of the Ashford family, now empty, and the name had stuck. It was a plain, honest Georgian house of red brick and pale stone, 3 stories high, with a walled garden behind and a great sweep of lawn before, and a stand of leafless beeches at the end of a lime avenue that ran to a small ornamental pond half frozen at its edges. Lady Aurelia Weston was waiting for them on the steps, wrapped in a great sable pelisse, and she was, Charlotte saw at once, exactly as her nephew had described her. A widow of 69, small, very upright, with a face like a fine old apple in autumn, and eyes as sharp as pinpoints and as kind as firelight, and a great deal of trouble to any person who deserved to be troubled. "So," said Lady Aurelia, taking both of Charlotte's hands in hers before Charlotte had quite descended the last carriage step. "You are the girl he crossed the ballroom for. Come inside, child. You will freeze." Charlotte, who had not been called child in 10 years by anyone who was not her mother, followed her indoors. The rooms of Little Weston were warm. That was the first thing Charlotte noticed. Fires had been lit in every room she was shown. Not the small, correct, polite fires of a house preparing for guests, but the deep, steady, banked fires of a house that meant to keep its guests. Charlotte, who had been cold at Ashcombe for 10 years without quite knowing she was cold, felt the difference the way one feels a weight lift. Her rooms, 2 of them, a bedroom and a small private sitting room, were on the 1st floor, at the back, looking out over the walled garden. In the bedroom a small round table had been set beside the window with a plate of biscuits and a pot of tea. In the sitting room a low chair had been drawn up before the fire, and beside the chair a small table, and on the table a book she had mentioned, 10 days ago, to Amelia, in a passing remark that she had not thought anyone else had overheard. Someone had. She sat down beside the fire and looked at the book, and then she looked at the fire, and she felt for the second time in her life the small sharp private pain of being seen when she had not asked to be, and she was surprised, again, by how nearly it was pleasure. Someone knocked, softly, at the door of the sitting room. Charlotte, who was used at Merrivale House to knocks that were not really knocks but announcements, said, "Come," and rose. Lady Aurelia entered. She was carrying a small green shawl over one arm. She stopped a pace inside the door and considered Charlotte with those pin-sharp eyes for perhaps 3 heartbeats. And then she said briskly, as if she had been asking a question and had received an answer, "Yes, that will do." She crossed the small room, laid the shawl over the arm of Charlotte's chair. "The fires are good here, child, but this house is old and its corners will find you." And at the door again paused. "Supper is at 7. We do not dress. Wear whatever pleases you." Then she was gone. Charlotte stood a moment with her hand upon the shawl, which was warm from its own passage through the house, and thought that she had never, in the whole of her 28 years, been given a shawl by anyone who did not require thanks for it. They stayed a fortnight. The fortnight became 3 weeks. The 3 weeks became a month. He did not press her. He kept his word. He rode out with her, most mornings, along the frozen lanes and through the naked beech wood. He did not gallop. He did not display. He rode beside her at her pace, on a big raw-boned bay gelding called Cato that reminded Charlotte, uncomfortably and finally, of another bay 10 years past. On the third morning he asked her, as they walked their horses along a lane where the frost still lay in the hoofprints of yesterday's ride, whether she was cold. She said she was not. He said mildly that she was, because the tip of her nose had gone pink and she had begun to keep her lower lip between her teeth, which she did. He had noticed, only when she was cold or thinking. She looked at him, startled. He looked steadily back. He did not press her to admit it. He only, when they came to the stile at the end of the lane, dismounted, drew from the pocket of his greatcoat a small folded square of soft wool, and handed it up to her. "It goes," he said, "inside the collar of your habit. My mother wore one every day of every winter of her life." She said the throat was the traitor. Charlotte took the small square of wool. She tucked it into the high collar of her riding habit, above the throat. She rode on. The warmth was small and immediate. The warmth of being noticed for it was neither small nor immediate. It moved through her the rest of the morning like a slow tide, and she did not, that night, quite know how to sleep for the feeling of it. He read to her, in the evenings, in the small library with the fire built up and Lady Aurelia knitting in the corner and Lady Merrivale dozing over her work-basket. He read Cooper aloud, and he read the sermons of a country parson he was fond of, and he read her, on the 5th evening, a passage of Boswell that made her laugh, and it was the first time in 10 years anyone had heard Charlotte Merrivale laugh in company, and Lady Aurelia laid down her knitting and looked at her nephew across the room with an expression that Charlotte, watching from the corner of her eye, would remember for the rest of her life. The passage was one about Dr. Johnson at breakfast in a poor inn, complaining, with immense theological gravity, about a small piece of underdone toast. Edmund read it in a straight, sober voice without playing for the laugh, which was, Charlotte discovered, the thing that made the laugh unavoidable. It came out of her before she knew it was coming. A small, warm, honest sound that surprised her more than it surprised the room. She lifted her hand to her mouth, half in reflex, half in apology. And then, catching Lady Aurelia's eye from the far corner, she lowered the hand again and let the last of the laugh escape. Edmund did not look up from the book. He turned the page. But there was, at the corner of his mouth, a very slight private line that had not been there a moment before, and Charlotte thought, quietly, into the warm firelit air of the library. I am going to remember this exact minute, this exact page, the exact color of the shawl on Aunt Aurelia's knee, for as long as I live. He talked with her about the estate, about the tenants, about a small charity school Lady Aurelia was patronizing in the village, about the roof of the dower house which wanted attention. He asked her opinions. He listened when she gave them. He asked her, one afternoon in the walled garden, standing under a leafless apple tree, whether she thought the small chapel at Ravencourt in Yorkshire, which she had never seen and might never see, should be re-roofed in slate or in oak shingles, and Charlotte, who had never before in her life been asked her opinion on a real thing by a man with any power to act on it, gave her opinion. He nodded and considered and gave his own reasoning, and Charlotte, who was accustomed to men who nodded politely and then did as they pleased, understood by the end of the conversation that if he had disagreed he would have said so, and that if he agreed he meant to act. She had, in this way, been quietly consulted on the running of an estate she had not yet seen and had not been asked to join. She stood for a moment after that particular walk was over, in the low doorway of the walled garden. watching him cross the gravel toward the house with his hands loosely behind his back and the folded architectural sketch still in one of them. She understood, standing there in the last of the afternoon light, that he had not asked her opinion as a kindness. He had asked it because he wanted it, and he had listened to it because he intended to use it, and this was a different order of asking altogether from the pleasant hollow questions she had been asked at dinner tables for 10 years. It was, she realized, the first time in her adult life a man had solicited her judgment in the same tone in which he would have solicited another man's, and it was a tone whose sound she had, until that afternoon, half thought did not exist. She understood him. She thought she understood him, but she was not sure. She was not sure that she was permitted to understand. The first thin cold shadow of trouble came in the second week of March, at a small dinner given by a neighbor called Sir Miles Standing. Sir Miles was a widowed baronet in his 40s, with a comfortable estate and an uncomfortable manner, and he had, 3 years before, made an offer of marriage to Amelia at a country dance, from which he had been gently refused. He had not, Charlotte gathered, quite recovered from being refused by a girl of 19. He had married nobody since. He had grown, instead, sharp. At table he was seated diagonally opposite Charlotte. He had spent the first 2 courses observing her, in a way that Charlotte, whose skin remembered the observation of ballrooms, felt without needing to look. Between the second and the third course, over the roast, he addressed her. "Miss Merrivale," said Sir Miles, "one hears the most extraordinary reports." "Does one, sir?" "One does. One hears that the Duke of Ravencourt is quite settled at Little Weston, on your account. His Grace is a very kind cousin to his aunt, sir." "His Grace," said Sir Miles, "is a very kind cousin to his aunt for 4 weeks together. In February. It is a remarkable devotion." Lady Aurelia, from the head of the table, set down her wineglass with a very small deliberate click. "Sir Miles," said Lady Aurelia mildly, "the roast is very good. I recommend attention to it." Sir Miles smiled with the corner of his mouth. He did not attend to the roast. He addressed Charlotte again. "Miss Merrivale, forgive an old friend of your family a plain question. Are we to congratulate you?" "Sir Miles," said Charlotte evenly, "I do not know what you mean by we, and I do not know what you mean by congratulate, and I am eating." There was a small, precise silence around the table. Lady Aurelia laughed. She laughed the small dry laugh of a duchess in all but the letter of the title, a laugh which had, in its time, ended men's evenings. "Well answered, my dear," she said. "Sir Miles, do drink your wine. It has been paid for." He drank his wine. He did not press her further at that meal. But on the way home in the carriage, jolting back through the moonlit lanes with a fur across her lap, Charlotte watched the black winter branches slide past the window and felt, for the first time since the January ball, a small cold weight settle at the back of her neck. There were people who did not wish her to be happy. She had known that dimly all her life. She had not known that a duke's attention would sharpen them. Sir Miles was not the worst of them. He was only the first. The worst of them was a young woman called Miss Selina Fairchild. Miss Fairchild was the pretty girl in the yellow gown, and Miss Fairchild was 23. And Miss Fairchild had been born beautiful and had been told she was beautiful and had built her entire understanding of the world around the fact of her beauty. And Miss Fairchild had, on the night of the January ball, watched a duke walk past her without seeing her, in order to bow to a woman of 28 in a grey gown. Miss Fairchild had not slept well since. Her hatred, as Lady Aurelia would later remark to Charlotte with clinical precision over tea, had nothing much to do with Charlotte herself. It was, said Lady Aurelia, entirely to do with the moment when Selina Fairchild, at the age of 23, had been made to understand, for the first time in her life, that beauty was not, in the eyes of every man alive, the highest currency in the room. "This is a shock that certain young women never recover from," said Lady Aurelia, "and Miss Fairchild is not going to recover from it. That does not excuse her. It only explains her. Remember, child, that explanation is not excuse. But it will help you not to hate her, and it will help you not to be surprised by her, and both are useful." Charlotte, who did not hate Miss Fairchild and had no wish to, listened and made mental notes and thanked her, and Lady Aurelia said only, "Drink your tea, child, it is going cold." But Lady Aurelia, having said the useful thing, did not leave the subject at once. She stirred her own tea, which did not require stirring, and said in an almost absent voice, "You will meet, my dear, over the years of your marriage, a number of women exactly like Selina Fairchild. Not all of them will be young, and not all of them will be beautiful, and not all of them will begin their lives in yellow silk. But they will share her wound, which is this, that they were told from childhood that their beauty was the entire value of their persons, and they believed it because everyone around them believed it, and now, when a man declines to notice their beauty, they experience it not as a preference but as an amputation. That is not to be mocked, child. It is to be understood. And then it is to be defended against, because a wounded woman with a false economy of herself will do a great deal of damage in the world before she learns to want to stop. Miss Fairchild's campaign, when it came, was not immediate. It came in the small crooked steps of a person who has decided to do harm and is testing where the ground gives. First it was a whisper, planted at the tea tables of London in the last week of March, that Miss Charlotte Merrivale had inveigled the Duke of Ravencourt through the offices of an unscrupulous aunt. Then it was a slightly firmer report that Miss Merrivale had known the Duke, in fact, some considerable time, that there had been an incident in her youth with a stable boy, and that the Duke, who had been traveling incognito through the north of England, had been that stable boy. Then it was a firmer report yet that Miss Merrivale, for all her pretense of quiet, had a history of correspondence with disreputable young men, and that letters existed, and that these letters could be produced. Then, in the last week of April, it was a letter itself. The letter arrived at Little Weston in a plain hand, addressed to the Duke of Ravencourt personally, and delivered by a boy who did not wait for a reply. It contained a single sheet of paper on which was written, in a hand designed to look youthful and imploring, "My dear Edmund, do not forget me. CM." It was undated. It was unsigned in full. It was in a hand that resembled, at a first careless glance, the hand of Charlotte Merrivale, and, at a second careful glance, the hand of nobody who had ever written a letter in earnest in her life. Edmund read it in his study. He read it twice. He set it down. He walked out of the study, closed the door behind him with a click that his valet, passing in the corridor, remembered afterwards for its unusual softness, and went in search of his aunt. He did not, at any point, go in search of Charlotte. He found Lady Aurelia in the small parlor with her knitting. "Aunt," he said. She looked up. "There is a letter." She set down her knitting. He gave her the sheet. She read it. She read it a second time. She folded it. She said, "Selina Fairchild. How can you be sure?" "Because I have known that family 30 years, and this is the exact species of arrow her mother would have chosen at her age, and Selina is not more inventive than her mother, only louder. Sit down, Edmund." He sat. "Now," said Lady Aurelia, "we are going to be intelligent. We are not going to be angry, and we are not going to be righteous, and we are certainly not going to be humiliated. We are going to be intelligent. What day is Lady Ashcombe's ball?" "The 11th of May. That gives us 15 days. Selina will not have shown that letter about yet. She is holding it. She is holding it against the ball because a ball is the maximum theater, and Selina understands theater if she understands nothing else. She will bring it out at Ashcombe. She will produce it publicly. That is what she wants. A public unmaking of Charlotte in the room in which Charlotte 10 years ago was invisible. That is her design. Then we shall not go to Ashcombe. We shall go to Ashcombe. Do not be foolish, Edmund. If we do not go, she will merely reset the trap for a later evening, and we shall be tired. We shall go. We shall let her spring it, and we shall be ready. And Charlotte." Lady Aurelia looked at her nephew, and her small sharp eyes softened by exactly the amount required to be steel and not stone. "Charlotte," she said, "you are not going to tell." "Not yet, Aunt." "Edmund, I love you dearly. Listen to your old aunt. If you tell that girl now, she will spend 15 days waiting for a public humiliation, and she will lose 8 pounds, and she will not sleep, and by the time we come into Ashcombe House she will be a thin, sleepless, frightened woman on your arm, and Selina will win before Selina speaks. Do not do that to her. Trust her steadiness. Prepare her one day out, not before. That is a great deal to ask of me. It is a great deal to ask of anyone. But you asked her to give you time, and she gave it, and now you must give her a little in return. Trust her." He was silent. Then he said, "Aunt, who will speak at the ball?" "Me?" Lady Aurelia looked at him for a long time. You, she said. You will speak. Because it is your name at the head of that letter. And because the room will listen to a duke and not to an aunt, however tiresome the aunt. And because you have, my dear, been waiting 3 years abroad to say what you are going to say. And this is your hour. He drew a slow breath. Very well, he said. Very well, aunt. We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. The days between the letter and the Ashcombe ball were, at Little Weston, days of an outward calm and an inward preparation. Edmund did not tell Charlotte about the letter. He did as his aunt had asked him and waited. But he did not, in those 2 weeks, once behave toward Charlotte as if she were not to be trusted. On the contrary, he behaved toward her, in that fortnight, as if she were the only person in the world who might be trusted at all. There were small proofs of this, sprinkled through the 14 days like coins dropped in a hand that had not been asked to hold anything before. He asked her, one morning, to read over a tenant's letter he had received from Ravencourt and to tell him what she made of the man's real request beneath the polite one. And when she gave him her reading, he thanked her and wrote his reply that afternoon in the sense she had suggested. He asked her, one evening, whether she would prefer, after they were married, for he spoke of it now as a settled matter, though without pressure, to keep Michaelmas at Ravencourt or in Kent. He asked her, one afternoon, if she liked the sound of a small conservatory built against the south wall of the walled garden, and if so what she thought should be planted in it. He did not, on any of these occasions, ask her opinion in order to be seen asking. He asked because he intended to know. He rode with her every morning. He read to her every evening. He walked with her, on the last day of April, along the frozen edge of the ornamental pond that was no longer frozen but only cold, for spring had come at last to Richmond, and the beeches at the end of the avenue had gone from black to a soft new smoke of green, and he asked her, on that walk, in a very quiet voice, if she would consent to be his wife. He asked her without ceremony. He did not kneel. He did not hold a ring. He stopped at a particular place on the gravelled path, where the sun through the young leaves fell across her shoulder, and he said, Miss Merrivale, Charlotte, I have known you 7 weeks. I would like to know you 70 years. Will you marry me? Charlotte stood very still, in a walking gown of a soft dove gray, with her hands in a small muff of gray lambswool, and her heart, which had for 10 years done its work quietly and without complaint, went once very hard against the bones of her chest. Yes, she said. She had, in the half-second before the word left her, run a quick honest inventory of her own reasons for it, because Charlotte Merrivale was not a woman who said yes to important questions without knowing what she was saying yes to. She had thought of her mother, whom she loved and forgave, and of Amelia, whom she also loved. She had thought of Little Weston and its small round table and the shawl that had been laid over the arm of her chair without thanks required. She had thought of a horse's cut fetlock in a summer 10 years past. She had thought of a duke who had crossed a ballroom without looking at anyone else. And she had thought, last and most privately, of herself, of a woman of 28 who had spent 10 years learning that she did not need to be chosen in order to be whole, and who was being offered, this afternoon under new beech leaves, not a rescue but a partnership. The yes, when it came, was small, but it was not thin. She had earned every letter of it. He nodded gravely. He took one of her gloved hands from the muff, and he lifted it, and he kissed the back of her glove once and set it down. Thank you, he said. That was all. They walked on. She said, half a minute later, sir. You are quite sure? I am quite sure, Miss Merrivale. You have known me 7 weeks. I have known of you 10 years, Miss Merrivale. That is different. Colonel Halston watched you 2 hours at 17, and he knew you. I have known you 33 days in your own person. I have watched you enough, I am sure. And you, he said gently, are permitted to take longer. I did not ask you for a decision. I asked you a question. You may answer it any way, or you may unanswer it. I will not hold you to today's yes if tomorrow is a no. She smiled, not a wide smile, but a small full one, the first he had ever seen upon her face without reserve. Sir, she said, I have been asked to answer in my life one question of importance. It is not going to be a difficult answer to keep. He looked at her a long moment then. It was, she thought afterwards, the first time she had seen him plainly relieved, as if some part of him that she had not been permitted, in 7 weeks, quite to see had at last been permitted to breathe. He said very quietly, "You must know that I would have accepted no from you, Charlotte. I would have gone north again, and I would have thought of you the rest of my life, and I would not have blamed you." She said in the same low voice, "I know that, sir." "That," he said, "is why I asked." They walked on beneath the young leaves. A blackbird went over the beechwood behind them. Somewhere, very far off, a bell was ringing in a village. Charlotte, walking beside her promised husband in the soft May sunlight, discovered that she was not afraid, and that the discovery was, in itself, an event. He looked at her for a moment. Then he offered his arm, and they walked on together beneath the young beech leaves, in a warm silence, up the lime avenue toward the house. On the day before the Ashcombe ball, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, in the small library at Little Weston, Edmund closed the door behind him and told her. He told her about the letter. He told her about Selina Fairchild. He told her about Lady Aurelia's counsel and the fortnight of silence. He told her, in his flat, plain, honest way, everything, and he asked her forgiveness for not having told her sooner. Charlotte listened. When he had finished, she said, quite calmly, "You did right. Aunt said the same. Aunt was right and you were right. I would not have slept a night. Now I have slept a fortnight." She rose. She walked to the window. She looked out at the young beech wood, and the gray sky, and the first small tulips coming up in Lady Aurelia's border. "And tomorrow," she said. "Tomorrow," said Edmund, "we go to Ashcombe. Miss Fairchild will produce the letter, or she will attempt to. She will do it publicly. She has arranged, we believe, for 2 of her intimates to be near her when she does it, so that the effect on the room is amplified. She will address you directly, or she will address me. Aunt believes she will address me. When she does, I will answer her." "How will you answer her?" He looked at her. He said quietly, "With the truth, the whole truth, every word of it. About Colonel Halston. About Colonel Halston. About the letter he wrote me on the moor. About the boy in the stable. About the girl by the window with the handkerchief for the bay. About all of it, Charlotte. About every reason I crossed that ballroom in January. If she wants the story, she shall have it. In front of every ear in London. And I do not think, when she has it, she will find it much of a weapon." Charlotte was silent. She looked at the tulips. "I do not wish," she said at last, "to be the cause of a public scene." "You are not the cause, Charlotte. She is. I only intend to see that the scene, when it comes, is one that leaves you standing." She turned from the window. "And what," she said, "am I to wear?" He smiled. A small crooked smile that she had come, in a fortnight, to love, and said, "That is precisely the question Aunt said you would ask. Aunt has an opinion. I imagined she would." Lady Aurelia's opinion, delivered that evening in the dressing-room with a cup of tea and the tone of a general placing artillery, was that Charlotte should wear pale gray. "Not white," said Lady Aurelia. "White is for girls, and you are not a girl, and Selina will be in white. She will glitter like a chandelier, and she will glitter poorly, because girls of 23 who are frightened glitter poorly. You will wear gray. You will wear the gray you wore in January. You will wear it because it is what you wore when he crossed the room, and because it is what you are, and because a woman who arrives at her own vindication dressed as her own truth is a woman who cannot be argued with. Do you understand me, child?" "I understand you, Aunt. Pearls. Your mother's pearls. Nothing else at the throat." "Yes, Aunt." "And Charlotte." "Yes, Aunt. Stand up. Stand up straight. I do not want you to enter that ballroom as a woman under threat. I want you to enter it as a woman who has already been chosen, and who is doing her chooser the courtesy of arriving on his arm. Chin up, child. That is my girl." They arrived at Ashcombe House at 9:30 on the evening of the 11th of May, and the ballroom that had been in January cold and thin-cornered was in May full and warm, the great doors open onto the terrace and the smell of new lilac drifting in from the garden, and Charlotte, entering on Edmund's arm in a gown of pale gray silk with a high modest neckline and long sleeves and a hem that fell clean to the polished floor, and her mother's pearls at her throat, walked into the room, without hurry and without flinching. In the hall, before they went in, he had stopped her a moment beneath the great chandelier. He had not spoken. He had only looked at her face, at the pearls, at the plain gray silk, and taken from his own breast pocket the forged letter of April, and shown it to her once, silently, and put it back. It was the small final gesture of a man saying, without needing to speak the words, "We know what is coming and we know it together." Charlotte had nodded once and taken his arm and drawn a single steady breath that felt, for the first time in a long life of breaths taken at the edges of rooms, like the breath of a woman entering rather than the breath of a woman waiting. The room turned to look at her. Turned, this time, not in surprise but in recognition. She had been talked about for 4 months. Every soul present had heard some version of her name. She was known, in the way one is known by rumor, and she came in on the arm of the man rumor had given her, and she came in dressed as herself, and the room, for the first time in her long acquaintance with it, adjusted itself around her the way rooms adjust around a woman they have decided to accept. They danced. He danced the first with her. He danced the third with her. He did not dance with anyone else, though propriety would have permitted it and though several mothers stood ready to be permitted. At 11:15, at the end of a country dance, Miss Selina Fairchild moved from her post near the terrace doors, and crossed the ballroom, and stopped in front of Edmund and Charlotte in a place where a good third of the room could see her, and produced from her reticule a folded piece of paper. "Your Grace," said Miss Fairchild, and her voice, though pitched low, carried, "May I have a moment of your time?" Edmund inclined his head. "Miss Fairchild, it is a small matter. It is a matter for the terrace, then. It is a matter, Your Grace, that I think is best addressed here." The music thinned, not stopped. Lady Ashcombe's musicians were too well trained for that, but thinned so that Miss Fairchild's voice, low as it was, filled the small pool of listeners at that end of the room. "You will forgive an old acquaintance, Your Grace," said Miss Fairchild, "for a small candor. I have come by a document. It is a document that concerns you, and it concerns Miss Merrivale. I do not, of course, believe a word of it, but I feel it is only right that Your Grace should see it, so that Your Grace may take such steps as are proper." She held out the folded paper. The room, or the part of it that was watching, held its breath. Charlotte, on Edmund's arm, did not tighten her hand upon his sleeve. She had been prepared. She had eaten a good dinner. She had slept a full night. She had drunk a small glass of ratafia at Lady Aurelia's insistence. She stood very steady. Edmund did not take the paper. He said, quite quietly, in a voice that carried none the less the length of a country dance, "Miss Fairchild, before I read that paper I should tell you 3 things." The room silently gathered. "The first," he said, "is that I know already what is written upon it. I know that it purports to be a letter from Miss Merrivale to me. I know that it is in a hand designed to resemble hers, and does not. I know that it is undated, and unsigned in full, and that it says only 'Do not forget me. C.M.' Because it was sent to me at Little Weston on the 23rd of April, and I have read it, and I have kept it, and it is in my breast pocket at this moment. Would you like to see mine, Miss Fairchild, or shall I first look at yours?" He said this in the pleasant, even tone of a man asking about the weather. Miss Fairchild's fingers tightened by a very small increment upon the folded paper. She was, Charlotte saw with a small clear pity, not accustomed to being addressed by a duke in the pleasant, even tone of a man asking about the weather when she had prepared herself for a duke about to be enraged. It was, Charlotte understood in that instant, the whole art of Lady Aurelia's counsel and of Edmund's execution of it, that a public trap depends for its snap upon shock, and that a public trap sprung upon a person who has already opened it, quietly, in his own breast pocket, snaps upon nothing at all. Selina had come armed with a scandal. She met, instead of scandal, the polite conversation of a man who had already read her letter, already known its author, already decided its consequence, and was now going to answer her not with heat but with the simple, deliberate weight of the truth. Miss Fairchild did not move. Her hand, holding the paper, did not tremble. But her face, in the space of 2 heartbeats, lost its color by very small, precise degrees. "The second thing I should tell you," said Edmund, "is that I do not believe Miss Merrivale wrote a word of that letter, or the one you sent me, or any letter of the kind ever to any man alive. I believe this because I have known Miss Merrivale, in a manner of speaking, for 10 years, and in her own person these 5 months, and I have never in my life met a woman less inclined to write to a man she did not know than she is. She has written to me exactly 4 times on questions of estate business, and each of her letters has been signed Charlotte Merrivale, in full, in ink, in the same steady hand in which she has done everything else in her life. I am not to be persuaded, by an anonymous slip of paper written in a hand that resembles hers only at a distance, that Miss Merrivale is other than what she is. Your Grace, began Miss Fairchild. The third thing I should tell you, Miss Fairchild, said Edmund, and now his voice had gone very low and very clear, and the whole of that end of the ballroom was silent, is why, upon a matter such as this, I do not require any letter at all in order to know my own mind. He turned, then, not away from Miss Fairchild. He turned deliberately to include the room. He looked in a slow full circle at the watching faces, at Lady Ashcombe, at Lady Merrivale white in her chair, at Amelia standing with her hand at her throat, at Lady Aurelia small and upright by the far pillar with a face that gave nothing away, at Sir Miles standing in the doorway sharp-eyed and watching, at the ranks of matrons on the gilt chairs, at the young women near the dais who had all, that spring, at one point or another, wondered aloud what the Duke of Ravencourt could possibly have found in Charlotte Merrivale. Then he looked at Charlotte. He said, I chose her not for her fortune, because she has none to speak of. I chose her not for her beauty, though she has more of it than this room has managed in 10 years to notice. I chose her not for her family, though I honor her family. I chose her not for her connections, and not for her accomplishments, and not for any account of her that any of you might give me tomorrow. I chose her because 10 years ago at Ashcombe, in the summer of 1813, at a picnic on this lawn, when she was 17 and in mourning for her brother, and no man in this county had asked her to dance for 6 months together, she gave her handkerchief to a stable boy to bind up the fetlock of a cut bay gelding. And when the boy's godfather, a soldier and a friend of my father's, saw her do it, he wrote it down in his private journal, and he did not stop writing it down for 10 years. And when he lay dying 14 months ago, in a house on the Yorkshire moors, he wrote to me, his godson, one last letter. And in that letter he wrote only this. He wrote, Go to Ashcombe. Look for the girl who wore grey by the window. She will still be by the window. Ask her to dance. And I did. He paused for the barest instant after those 3 words. Charlotte, standing at his side, felt the pause of the room around him. A pause that was not silence but attention, the exact quality of attention that a great orator earns and does not command. Lady Ashcombe on her dais had lowered her fan and did not lift it again. Lady Merrivale in her chair by the far wall had put one hand up to her mouth. Amelia, standing with the young Viscount who had not, that season or any other, wondered aloud what her sister could be worth, had gone very still. Sir Miles, standing in the doorway, had, for the first time in his adult life, taken half a step backward without knowing he was doing it. Only Lady Aurelia, small and upright by the far pillar, had not moved a muscle, because Lady Aurelia had known, from the moment she read the forged letter in her parlor, that this was the room in which her nephew would speak the sentence he had been abroad 3 years finding, and Lady Aurelia was a woman who did not spend a great deal of energy on foregone conclusions. I chose her because when I crossed this ballroom in January, on the strength of an old man's letter, she did not smile prettily, and she did not flutter, and she did not perform any of the small false things that are performed in rooms such as this. She stood, and she looked me in the face, and she waited for me to say something worth her hearing. And when I told her the plain truth, she believed me, because she is a woman who knows the truth when it is put before her. I chose her because in 5 months I have not once heard her ridicule a person weaker than herself, nor flatter a person stronger, nor lie about a small thing to make herself look larger. I chose her because she was kind to a cut horse, and she was kind to a frightened younger sister, and she is kind to my ridiculous aunt, and she was kind to me on the first night we met when I gave her every reason to think me a fool. I chose her because our society, Miss Fairchild, is a foolish society, and it has read her face wrongly for 10 years, and I have spent 3 years abroad watching foolish societies do the same, and I have come home tired of it. I chose her, in short, because she was there, invisible in this exact room, in the exact spot she is standing tonight, and because a good man saw her when the rest of us did not, and because I have had the great and unearned luck to be given, by his hand, a second chance to see her also. Now, he turned back to Miss Fairchild. His face had not become cruel. It had become only quiet. You may keep your paper, Miss Fairchild. It is a matter of very little interest to me now. And I will ask you, this once and privately, as one member of a small society to another, to leave Miss Merrivale alone. She has done you no harm. She wishes you none. If your quarrel is with me, for having failed to notice you in a doorway, I regret it, and I ask your pardon for the failure. But it is not, Miss Fairchild, a quarrel that has anything to do with her. It has to do with you. I ask you to remember that. He waited. Miss Fairchild, whose hand still held the paper, drew it back very slowly and lowered it to her side. Your Grace, she said, in a voice not quite steady, I bid you good evening. She curtsied briefly and turned, and walked from the ballroom with her chin up as high as she could hold it. Charlotte, watching her go, felt for her a brief unwelcome pity, and set it aside, because charity is one thing and self-defense is another, and Charlotte had learned, in a fortnight, to know the difference. Lady Ashcombe, from her chair, gave a small nod. The musicians, who had been holding a single note, released it, and the country dance resumed, and the ballroom, having witnessed a small execution in perfect quiet, breathed out. Edmund turned to Charlotte. He offered her his arm. Miss Merrivale, he said, would you do me the honor of the next dance? Charlotte looked at him. Sir, she said, I have not been asked to dance by any man not you for 10 years. That, he said, is a great pity, and it does the room no credit. Will you come? She placed her hand on his. They danced. And when the set ended, and the ballroom began to loosen for supper, he did not lead her to the supper room. He led her instead, on her small nod, out onto the terrace, past the tall open doors, past the smell of new lilac drifting in from the garden, and along the gravel to a place at the balustrade where the lantern light fell soft upon the stone and the noise of the ballroom became again the distant thin thing it had been 10 years ago behind a curtain. He stopped there. He turned her to face him. He did not touch her further than her hand upon his arm. Charlotte, he said, forgive me if that was too much. It was not too much, sir. It was a great deal to say in a public room. It was, sir. And it was necessary, and it was true, and I thank you for it. I did not say it, he said, for the room. I said it because I have wanted, since January, to say it, and because I did not, until tonight, have a room in which it required saying. It is not, Charlotte, it is not a speech. It is only what I think. I am only telling you what I think. She stood very still under the lantern. The May air was warm on her bare wrists where she had drawn off her gloves for supper. Below them, in the dim garden, the new lilac made its heavy sweet noise in the dark, and a nightingale, somewhere in the shrubbery, tried 3 notes and stopped. Charlotte thought, with the small clear internal precision that she was going to bring, later, to the running of a duchy. I have been standing at edges of rooms for 10 years, and I did not know that all along I was standing at the edge of this one. I did not know that this room existed. I did not know that this terrace, on a warm May night, with this man upon it, was the room that had been waiting. And now that I do know, I shall not pretend not to know. It would be a discourtesy. To him, to myself, to the good old man in the ground in the north who wrote the letter. She looked up at him. The lantern light was warm upon his face. He looked, in that light, unguarded, younger than his 32 years, tired around the eyes with the ride from Yorkshire in January and the letter in April and the fortnight of held silence. She said, quietly, Edmund. He drew a breath. She had not called him by his Christian name before. Edmund, she said again, I was seen tonight. Whatever comes of us, whatever comes. I was seen. Even when I thought I was invisible, I was seen. By an old man on a lawn in a summer. By his godson in a ballroom in a winter. By you tonight. And that is a thing, sir, that 10 years of standing by windows had led me to think would not happen. And it has happened, and I am altered by it. I do not think I know yet how altered. But altered, sir. And grateful. He did not answer at once. He lifted her hand, unloved now, for she had drawn the gloves off in the ballroom for supper, and he turned it, and he kissed the inside of her wrist, once, quite gently, where her pulse ran steady. Charlotte Merrivale, he said, against her wrist. I would like to marry you as soon as the banns can be called. That, said Charlotte very steady, is a most acceptable proposal, sir. He laughed. It was a small laugh, quiet, entirely private, and she had not heard him laugh before. She thought, with a small clear internal recognition, "I would like, please, to hear that laugh in my house for the next 50 years, thank you." And she said nothing of it because she was, as she had always been, a woman who said less than she felt, and this had, for perhaps the first time, become an advantage rather than a wound. They stood a while longer on the terrace, in the soft lantern light, in the smell of new lilac. Then they went in to supper. The banns were called on the following 3 Sundays at the parish church nearest Little Weston, and on the last Saturday of June, in a plain morning ceremony attended by no more than a dozen persons, Miss Charlotte Merrivale of Merrivale in Kent became Charlotte Ashford, Duchess of Ravencourt. She wore, at her own quiet request, a gown of pale grey silk. A year passed. In the spring of the following year, on a morning of soft sunlight and new leaves, Charlotte Ashford, Duchess of Ravencourt, stood upon the top step of the south front of Ravencourt House in Yorkshire, in a plain morning gown of dove grey and a fichu of white lawn, and watched a stable boy of about 16 walk a big raw-boned bay gelding down the gravelled sweep toward the mounting block. The gelding was Cato, older by a year and no worse for it. The boy leading him was called Tom. He was the son of Ned Halston, who had been, at 17, the stable boy at Ashcombe. Ned was gone into the army long since, but his boy Tom had come to Ravencourt at Edmund's invitation the previous autumn, and had been made an apprentice under the head groom, and had already, in his 8 months at the house, made himself useful. Charlotte watched him lead the gelding. He led him well. The morning air was cool and clean, and the yard smelled of straw and warm horse and the faint iron of the pump water that had been drawn an hour ago for the troughs. Somewhere beyond the low stone wall of the yard a lamb was being called by its ewe with the small hoarse insistence of a lamb who has been called for the 3rd time and had not answered on the first 2. A magpie went across the archway with a flash of blue-black. In the far window of the tack-room, old Rossiter the head groom paused for a moment in polishing a bit and looked out at his Duchess sitting on the stone step with a bay horse's leg across her lap, and Rossiter, who did not smile lightly and had not smiled at a Duchess in his 53 years at Ravencourt, permitted himself one small approving nod at the pane. Charlotte did not see him. She was speaking quietly to the horse. Cato had a small nick in his off forefetlock. Not a serious cut. A scrape, taken yesterday on a stony bit of the Tennant Road. It had been cleaned and bound with a strip of clean white linen. Charlotte had bound it herself that morning, sitting on the stone step of the stable-yard with the horse's leg across her lap, while Tom held the head collar and watched. The linen was a handkerchief, not the original. That handkerchief, given in the summer of 1813 to another stable boy for another cut bay, had been lost long ago, kept for years, Edmund had told her, in the pages of Colonel Halston's private journal, until the colonel's death, when it had passed with the journal to Edmund, and thence, on the morning after their wedding, from Edmund into Charlotte's own keeping, in a small carved box on her dressing-table beside her mother's pearls. The handkerchief on Cato's fetlock this morning was one of Charlotte's own, embroidered in a corner with a small C.A. in white silk, that being now her monogram. She had bound the horse's cut with it because she had, again, been the person in the yard, and because Regency Yorkshire, like Regency Kent, was a place in which competent kindness in a duchess counted for more, in the running of an estate, than any amount of tepid ornament. Edmund came out onto the top step behind her. He had been in his study since breakfast, over the plans for the re-roofing of the small chapel, in oak shingles on her advice, which had proved on inspection to be correct. He stood a moment behind her, and then he set his hand very lightly at the small of her back, the exact polite Regency distance, or perhaps a very small fraction less. "Wife," he said. "Husband," she said, "you have bound another horse." "I have bound another horse." "You know that this will become a habit," he said. "I hope so, sir. You know that the boy Tom will tell his grandmother, who will tell her sister, who will tell the vicar's wife, who will tell all of Yorkshire, that the Duchess sits on the stable step in her grey gown and binds cut horses with her own handkerchiefs." "I hope so, sir." "You know that Yorkshire will love you for it." "I hope so, sir." "Yes." He was silent a moment. Then, still with his hand at the small of her back, he said, "Charlotte, Edmund, do you remember what I said to you on the terrace at Ashcombe?" "Every word, sir." "I said you were seen. Even when you thought you were invisible, you were seen." Yes. I want, he said, in a low voice, to say a further thing, which is that you are also now seeing. There is a boy in this yard whose father was a stable boy at 17, and who was himself 16, and whom no one at this house had noticed had a talent for horses until you took him aside at Christmas and put him under Rossiter. That is you seeing, Charlotte. That is a duchess seeing. That is what you are. You have not stopped, my love, at being seen. You are seeing now. And that is a much rarer thing in this world than the other, and I will spend the rest of my life grateful for it. Charlotte did not answer for a moment. She watched Tom lead the bay to the mounting block, and she watched the horse settle, and she watched the morning light lift across the paddock beyond, and she thought of a curtain the color of old rose in a ballroom 500 miles south, and of a boy of 17 in a stable yard 10 years past, and of an old man on a moor with a letter, and of the way it had all come, in the end, to a stone step in a Yorkshire morning with her husband's hand steady at her back. She turned her face up to his. Then let us go on, Edmund, she said quietly, and see what else there is to see. He held her look for a beat, and then, with the small private smile she had come to know as the whole and secret truth of him, he inclined his head, the exact inch he had inclined it in her mother's drawing-room 5 months earlier, the inch that meant I have heard you, I have weighed it, I intend to honor it. And he answered her, in the low voice that had once carried the length of a January ballroom. Yes, my love, let us go on. There is a great deal to see. And I think between us, you seeing and I standing beside you, we shall see most of it in time. He bent his head and kissed her once on the temple. They went in together, out of the sunlight, into the warm. Somewhere at Ashcombe House, that same morning, there stood by a window in an empty ballroom a young woman of 28 who had lately arrived from Cornwall with her cousin. Her name, though we shall not stop long enough over her to use it fairly, was Miss Anna Trevelyan, and she had come up to town because her cousin's Aunt Bettina had heard, from a lady in Truro, that London was not so unkind a place to a plain sensible girl as it had used to be. Anna was not certain of the report, but she had come. And she had come, this morning, to see Ashcombe House in daylight, because Lady Ashcombe was a distant connection of her cousin, and because the housekeeper had been kind enough to permit her to walk the empty ballroom before the shutters were closed for the summer. She had a plain, sensible face, and a plain, sensible gown, and no man in her county had asked her to dance in 6 seasons together. She was looking at the polished floor. She had been told, by the housekeeper, that a duke had once crossed this room for a woman who had stood exactly where she stood now. She did not, of course, believe it, but she stood a little straighter and she looked, for the first time in a long while, at the far arch of the east door, in case, one day, the doorway should darken with the shape of a man who had come, at last, to look for her. Rooms remember, sometimes, the good that has been done in them, and sometimes, when they remember, they arrange to do it a second time. Somewhere, in a house on the moors of Yorkshire, a girl called Isolde is at this moment being told by her father that she must marry a beggar at the gate. And the beggar, though her father does not know it, is not a beggar at all. That is the next story, and it is a good one, and we will tell it soon. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.